Recording? Welcome to all of you. The second of our talks this spring, and it's a very rare talk, a rare occasion for us. It is very rare that we invite one of our own students. It was possible that they worked at Tufts and then gone on and become professors. But here we have an unusual student, and our very own Aniket, who was a senior he was an undergraduate at Tufts and then did his senior thesis, which is now published. This is again very rare. I don't know many people. But then Aniket is a rare entity altogether, and I don't mean to embarrass you at all. You know, when he first arrived at Tufts, we all used to joke amongst ourselves that he was like a graduate student, an undergraduate arrived, but really was a graduate student. And I think that he has consistently proven that, jokes aside, he really was an extremely committed and involved student. I think he's an inspiration, not just for his own age group, but also for many of us, of the kind of work he does. But this is an exceptional work that he did as a senior at Tufts, with working with me and with Sarah Pinto, who's sitting with us. And did you work with Brian as well?
Yes.
And Brian Hatcher as well. And so we all three of us are extremely proud of this and delighted that the book is out. So we had to sort of do something at Tufts to celebrate. Not that we're being able to do very much because we're still masked, there's still problems, but I just wanted to warmly welcome Aniket back to Tufts to give his first book talk, and certainly will not be the last. So congratulations and welcome. This is sweet. That was very, very, very considerate of you.
Very innovative.
Thank you, Professor Jalal, so much for that really touching introduction. It is a rare privilege for me to be here. I have literally grown up listening to this seminar series in particular. Every work has its intellectual and institutional context, and mine was most certainly that of Tufts. Often when I write, and when many of us write, we have an imagined audience in mind, people who you write for, and in my case, it's most definitely many of the people in this room. And so it's really rare to be in an event like this. I owe a lot to Professor Jalal and Professor Bose for their support. To Professor Pinto, who's here, and to Professor Hatcher, who I believe is joining us over the webinar. Thank you for all your support. I also want to thank Tufts. Anne is here, and more of the Summer Scholars Program, and which was sort of the first seed of this work. And for those of you still in your freshman or senior or even junior years, I think the Summer Scholars is a great opportunity to get started with your research, and I just wanted to flag that before starting. I think what I'll do is I'll just introduce the book and say what it's about.
Show it to us as well.
Yes. I'll just introduce what the book is about a little, maybe read out one or two performances from it, and then ask for your views. I think just before I begin delving into the book, I thought I'll just quickly outline the sort of key themes that have informed this book and my work beyond. I think the most important concern is to think of cultural spaces beyond national and communitarian boundaries. national, in this case of India and Bangladesh, and communitarian in the case of Hindu and Muslim. And I really have a problem with the term folk culture and everything it signifies. It's no longer used that much in anthropological analysis anymore, but I think the vestige of it remains in much of scholarship on South Asian cultures. And I think history and its disciplines can be a very nice tool to question the idea of it. And that's something, one thing I try to do in this work. I also try to integrate archival and ethnographic methods. This was part of me being a history and anthropology double major at Tufts. I tried to, put into practice what I learned and look at the idea of space through it. And we can talk about to what extent that has been successful. And I think more broadly draw a distinction between space and territory. I'll go through this distinction in more detail later, but I think it's a very crucial distinction for us to understand space as something that can be shared, as opposed to territory that can only be possessed. And I think the full implications of this distinction can be very useful for understanding nation states and cultural performances in South Asia. So I see this is the cover of the book. I see it very much as sort of working out some of these problems through it and taking it later into my graduate work currently. The book, in some ways, is about a very small topic. It's about one performance form in what is now the India-Bangladesh border. And it traces the history of the performance is called Gombhira. And it traces the history of that performance. It's a very localized and small performance over about 100, 150 years from the late 19th century to the present day. Before I go any further, I think this is a good time to begin by narrating the performances on one side. So where this is all happening is basically somewhere here. This is the Indian side. This is the India-Bangladesh border towards the north. The Indian town is called Malda, and the town in Bangladesh is called Chapai Nawabganj. This is the border that was drawn in 1947 when the partition of India happened. And so that is where we are. So it starts. It was close to midnight in Malda town. The clatter of auto rickshaws had lulled. Food carts were stacked on the sidewalk. Time and again, trains rumbled over the Mahananda Bridge and trucks boomed towards the Bangladesh border. A crowd of about 50, men, women, and children sitting in a circle under a blinking street lamp had gathered to watch a form of street theater known as Gombhira. Amor Mondol, this is the name of a performer, and 3 other men, thin red towels tied on their heads, were playing 4 peasants. But the god Shiva, the central character of Gombhira in Malda, was nowhere to be found. And performers all start calling Shiva, come out, come out, come out, we need to talk, and so. After several calls and threats, the god tottered from behind the lamppost, carrying a trident and a cell phone. Groggy and irritated, he took off his earphones. And Shiva, you can see the god, he says, can't a god smoke weed and listen to music in peace? Who are you? What do you want? And the first peasant said, sir, we are testers of the BPL company. And Shiva says, wow, BPL, the big electronics company. He thinks the electronics company, British Physical Laboratories, that makes televisions and washing machines and so on. Then the second peasant says, Shiva, BPL means below poverty level. Shiva, is this a joke? What do you mean by tester then? The third peasant, this is the guy in front, says, of course we are testers, sir. What else can we be? All pharmaceutical companies test their new drugs on us. If we live, they sell the drugs. If we die, nobody has any liability. Can you get better testers? And then all peasants together say, and while we are dying like this, you are smoking weed? What kind of a god are you? Shame on you, Shiva. Shiva tried to protest, but his voice was drowned in cheers from the audience. Children who sat closest to the performers laughed and clapped. Over the next 2 hours, the peasants attacked the god with a battery of complaints, from the poor condition of roads to the global economic crisis of 2008. They let go of Shiva only when the god broke into tears, knelt before the kids in the audience, and promised to take better care of them. Dialogues between Shiva and the peasants define Gambhira performances in Malda, today in West Bengal, India. By complaining to the god and by making fun of him, performers, exclusively men, because this is a performance done by men, whereas women are in the audience mostly, they draw attention to the problems faced by poor people of the region. O Shiva, Gambhira is not for worshipping you, the concluding song went. It is a weapon to fight against everything wrong in the world. So this is what is happening in Malda in the Indians. Had you traveled from Malda town to Chapai Nawabganj before 1947, it would have been an uneventful 30-mile journey through mango orchards, paddy fields, and the ruins of the medieval city of Gaur. This is one of the ancient capitals of Bengal, which is scattered on 2 sides of the border. Now you have to make sure you have a passport, a pre-issued visa. The nearest consulate is 200 miles south in Kolkata, and currencies of 2 countries before embarking on your trip. After trudging alongside a line of trucks, you get your passport stamped, have your bags inspected, and then walk through the barbed fence into the People's Republic of Bangladesh. But as soon as you walk in, the landscape is familiar again. Mango groves dotted with little brick mosques, the river Mahananda too meandering across the border. Chapai, like its twin district across the border, is known for Gambhira performances. It was dusk in Chapai, moments after the end of Maghrib, the evening prayer. Men were leaving the mosque and heading towards the riverfront, where boatmen had cleansed a corner, and women had laid reed mats and had hung kerosene lamps from boughs of mango trees. Mohidul and Rafiq, boatmen of the Mahananda, wore loincloths and conical hats, holding wooden sticks in their hands. So this is one of the boatmen in the Mahananda River in Chapai. Mohidul, sporting a flowing white beard, played the grandfather, Nana, a peasant elder. The young Rafiq played his grandson, Nati. So this is the grandson. I mean, this is a different performance, but this is what the aesthetics look like. This is the old, the elder and his grandson. And then they begin exchanging dialogues. The grandson, Nana, where is this river coming from? This river. The Mahananda, it is coming from India. But that is a different country. Is the river a foreigner then? The word foreigner was used in English. No, how can you say such things? That river is a part of our country. I do not get it, Nana. If the river is not a foreigner, then why do we divide the people who drink its water? A few miles upstream, human beings like us drink the same water from the same river, but they are Indians and we are Bangladeshis. How does that make sense? Rafiq then calls a little girl in the audience if it made sense to her. She shook her head. He then showed his palms to the audience. They were covered with sand and silt because, of course, he's a boatman. His hands are muddy. Look at my hands, Nana. Look at the bits of soil on my hands that the river has brought. They have all come down the mountains in foreign countries. Is the soil of our country a foreigner too? The musicians begin playing the harmonium, a tune that boatmen sing while struggling against the tide in the Mahananda. Mohidul and Rafiq sang together. You may live in a different country, you may follow a different religion, but if the Mahananda brings soils on your palms, you are my brother, you're my sister. A border may divide us, but so what? The same river is our mother. As you have figured out by now, there is no Shiva in the Gambhira performed in Chapai. A peasant elder and his grandson have substituted the god and the peasants. So what? Rafiq grinned when I brought up the difference while chatting with him after the performance. Don't we all complain about the same things in the end of the day? So these are the 2 performances on 2 sides. Now picture the cracks on Rafiq's palm, the lumps of dead skin, the beads of clay, the arteries clogged with atoms of sawdust and jute. He once taught me the details of the landscape of Malda and Chapa using the creases on his palm. The thicker groove above was the big river, Ganga, flowing east. the thin stream cutting downwards, the humbler Mahananda. Note the chunk just below my index finger, he said. This is the Barin, the old red land which was forested for many years. Now see the valley sloping down towards my wrist, the new mudflats of the Ganga where we live. At last the line across his palm, the remnant of a cut from a piece of iron jutting out of his boat. That wound is the border between India and Bangladesh that divides the land of Gambhira, he grinned. Not as old as the other lines, but it still hurts. Like the rivers, hillocks, and fields where its performers dwell, the song of Gambhira, the world of Gambhira, is far older than the border that cuts through it. The songs of peasants along the Mahananda were part of an old agrarian rite performed in Bengal, at least since the late Mughal period, worshipping Shiva for good health and harvest. Something very interesting is happening here because Shiva in Bengal is very different from the images of Shiva you have in, say, North India. He's not the majestic, all-powerful God of the Trinity as you see it. He's a lazy, hemp-smoking peasant who's a sort of a henpecked husband and doesn't really do much work. And you see very much that cultural vocabulary coming through in these performances. And it may be tempting to interpret this divergence of the two Gambhiras, as many folklorists routinely do, as an expression of national difference, right? I mean, this is the part that struck me. Initially, when I began, I just knew about the Malda and Gambhira, the theater around Shiva. But then I realized the figure around with everything that is going on in Bangladesh. And there is not much scholarship, not any scholarship on this in English at all. But there is some scholarship in Bengali. And the interpretation there is, this is the Hindu way of doing things, and this is the Muslim way of doing things. You're Hindus, you worship God, so you have Shiva. You're Muslims in Bangladesh, so you're iconoclastic. So you have substituted the God. Now, from the two performances I have just described to you, I think it's amply clear that that is not the right way of understanding this at all. Because there is, on the one hand, there is nothing worshipping going on in the Hindu side, and on the other hand, even in the Muslim side, it's not really about religious beliefs in the sense of religious identity. And that is what led me to question how best to understand this, how best to interpret this very interesting cultural event in the border. I think this is one way that scholars, at least in this part of India, have often interpreted it, is by the trope of the borderland. There's a major work by the Dutch historian Willem van Schendel called The Bengal Borderland. Van Schendel's interpretation is that the strips of land around the international border between India and Bangladesh is a region in itself. It has its own culture, it has its own connections, it's a peculiar zone. Now, this part has certain merits, this approach, in the sense that it sort of decenters your essentialist national approaches. You at least have one way to talk about, some way to talk beyond India and Bangladesh and Hindu and Muslim. You recognize the borderland as its own thing. The problem is it essentializes the borderland a little bit. It almost makes it, as anthropologists would say, a liminal space where magical things happen that is sort of hybrid, neither here nor there. And even more importantly, what's most frustrating for a historian is you can't really go beyond 1947 when the border was drawn, because if there is no border, you can't have a borderland before that in the sense of the term. And this is why histories of the India-Bangladesh border never go beyond 47 in the Van Schendel school of doing things, which I found quite frustrating, because here we have at least an early modern ritual with fascinating history in the early 20th century that has to be completely ignored if I'm to interpret this only as a thing of the borderland, which is why I use the more expansive concept of space. Just seeing it as a space. Space has historically constituted over time, and there are human geographers, Doreen Massey being one who might have cited here. The insight is quite simple. It's that space is not simply there. It's a product of human interrelations. As social relations change, the space that is produced changes there too. The social relations can be of all sorts. It can be relations of production, relations of nation states, even relations within family, and so on. And I try to develop the idea of shared spaces from there, because I think one of the most useful ways of seeing Gambhira is sort of a shared space between the two communities, mainly Hindus and Muslims, but also Christians, but also other indigenous populations in the area. It seems that the space of performance actually allows people to interact and talk to each other, have fun with each other, laugh together, beyond and across their identities. This is not something new, but I think sometimes our categories hamper us from interpreting this. It's a part of everyday life in South Asia. And that is where I'm coming from with this work. So, for instance, talking about the borderland, I think it's to explain this concept a little more. I think it's worth thinking. So this is the border. This is the immigration checkpost near the India-Bangladesh border. This hut where you go to get your passport stamped and so on. I'll explain the next map in a second. It's a hand-sketched map that I did in the field, and it does appear in the book. But let me read a small performance to show what this little map is all about. And this actually happens on another night in Malda, where Shiva, as usual, can't be found. He's never to be found. And then they again call Shiva. And Shiva, finally fighting for air, comes out from one of the rundown public toilets from behind the two peasants. "What a horror of a toilet," the god exclaimed. "Does it never occur to you that it needs cleaning? Why were you hiding there?" one of the peasants asked. "Is your girlfriend inside?" "Shut up. I went to relieve myself after a long journey upstream." "Upstream? What were you doing there?" "I think I know." And this is Azim, who's playing the third peasant. He's Muslim. "He meets Pir Baba at my tea stall every afternoon. They have a cup of tea, and then Shiva, Baba, goes upstream, and Pir Baba sails downstream. Azim runs a tea stall and also looks after a Pir shrine." So I want you to note how the performance is really close to their everyday life and occupation. So a tea stall owner now performing at night says, "Oh yes, Shiva and Pir Baba, they have tea with me every evening. It's not a big deal." "Really? You are friends with the Pir Baba?" "Oh yes," Shiva smiled. "He's an old friend. He loves weed as much as I do." "What nonsense, Nana," the other peasant charged. "Here the border divides Hindus and Muslims, and you smoke weed with the Pir Baba. You're a liar and hypocrite." "Oh, come on, don't be stupid," Shiva said. "We all know that foolish people who drew the border had their eyes closed. Both Pir Baba and I wonder why they drew the border between East and West if they wanted to divide Hindus and Muslims. As all of you know," and he addresses the audience, "my children live north, and Pir Baba's children live in the south. Now we have to do double duty." The word double duty was in English. "All of our children are scattered, and both of them have now to check on them on both sides of the border. And what duty is that?" Jonathan, one of the peasants, smirked. "Both of you smoke weed anyway all day." "Oh, really?" Shiva was now livid. "Who clears the forest upstream, if not me? Who makes the mudflats, chores downstream, if not Pir Baba? Just because we relax later with a little weed, you think you can shout at us? Do you know how much work we have to do?" Annoyed, he placed his trident on the ground and crossed his arms. Many in the audience clapped, recognizing the god's hard work. After all, Bimal, who was playing Shiva in the Gambhira performance, was a construction worker who made ends meet by carrying bricks, cement, and sand. So that's where the work part made sense. But I found this story absolutely fascinating, because when I went back to the archive, so this is basically tracking the routes, right? So Shiva is going upstream, and P. Baba with his sickle is going downstream. You can actually trace two migrations in the late 19th, early 20th century, which I think this story in some ways is alluding to. And if you check the demographics, it's actually right. The Muslim majority areas are downstream in regions that are Murshidabad, whereas the Hindu, so-called Hindu and indigenous populations are concentrated upstairs. None of this came into the colonial map-making, border-making, project. And this actually refers to two very specific projects of clearing the forest upstream, in which indigenous laborers were recruited from different parts of the world, parts of Bengal to clear, and that's the Barin. That's the history of settling that area. Whereas a lot of Muslim peasants from East Bengal migrate to the new mudflats of this region. There's a massive migration in this period also to Assam at the same time, but it extends here too. This, I mean to say only this, is to call this region just a borderland explains nothing about all of these processes that are going on, and processes that are much more alive in people's memories and the way they see this region, as opposed to if you just see their history from the recent past. And so I think the way I go, not to go into too deeply into the book, I sort of I begin from the first chapter talking about these migrations and the constitution of this region in the late 19th century, and then move on through the 20th century, talking about the beginnings of the anti-colonial movement, the sort of introduction of mass politics in the mid-20th century, and finally partition. So these are the different series of changes that happen in the 20th century. And I follow these changes by looking at the history of Gomphira up close as it continues. One axe to grind I have throughout this book is to question this notion of folk culture. And this is, I want to pause a little bit and think about this term a little bit. We no longer use this term in our analysis, but it remains very much alive as a category in South Asia, in the politics of South Asia. And there are others, I think Frank Coram, who's probably with us in the audience in the webinar, has written about this. Folk as a category means essentially outside history, that you see folk culture, an ethnic culture, a view of it as if it has been outside, and there's been no changes. And it's very interesting when you see the Bengali writings of Gomphira produced from India and Bangladesh. Both present Gomphira as an ancient Vedic ritual and whatnot has been going on always, sort of an essence of the nation, so on and so forth. Now, of course, we can dismiss those in scholarship, but they have great relevance in politics in both sides of the border. I mean, the picture that you see is a huge building. It's just of that. It's really the largest building in town, Chapai Nawabganj. It's the folklore academy of that region, run by the Bangladeshi state. A lot hinges on culture and cultural identity here. The question of the market is equally important, at least in Bengal. I have a section here on Gomphira masks and the mass production of masks that has happened. And this is mostly for the market of the urban consumers who use them to decorate their houses in Kolkata and even in Delhi and so on. And there, that essentialized notion of the folk is kind of important to sell it in some ways. So it is all of these apparatuses that keep the concept very much alive in day-to-day life. One way to, sort of to puncture this, or even in any ways to analyze it, is to de-essentialize it and see it as historically constituted. The way I did it in this book is to see the constant dialectic between the metropolis, which is Calcutta, and the Mufassil, as it is called, which is Malda. Because you often think folk culture is just rural, right? And elites have absolutely nothing to do with it. And there is actually, if you follow from the late 19th century, the elite idea of, it's a term used by elites in different ways, and it's not a term given by the people. I've never heard Gomphira performers themselves call Gomphira folk culture. So one instance of this was this major anti-colonial thinker who was actually from Malda, but later had his career in Kolkata and later over much of the world, including the United States. He came to Harvard and New York as well. Binoy Kumar Sarkar. You will find a lot of literature on him, especially his English language writings in different ways, but it's very interesting that one of his earliest works in his earliest youth was with Gombhira performers. And it is he, along with other Calcutta elites and the local elites of Malda to an extent, who sort of works with Gombhira performers to restructure what used to be a ritual into a form of performance or a theater. And in many ways, the Gombhira, in terms of the theater we see today, is born out of that moment of the Swadeshi movement in Bengal, which is the early 20th century. And so I rely on these publications in Bengal. This says Gombhira, a journal called Gombhira used to come out from Malda in the 1910s, which was actually a journal of Western philosophy. It had nothing to do with folk culture. You would find articles about Kant and Hegel and whatnot in that, which should at least make us pause and think what exactly is going on, what exactly is the term folk doing here, and so forth. So I think the question of nationalism and folk culture is historically changing, and paying attention to that is one of my major goals of this project. The other thing I'll just mention about Binoy Sarkar is that he had a protege in Malda, and his name was Sufi Master. This is his only picture that I have found. He comes to be the most significant Gombhira performer of the 20th century. As his name suggests, he's a Muslim, but he is very well known for his songs of Shiva in the early 20th century, pre-partition. Post-partition, he plays a major role, what we will see. But this is one connection I wanted to highlight, and this is, I think, one of the main contributions of the book is to point out this connection. Which brings us, head on about the question of communalism. It's an old and tired term, but I think yet sadly very prevalent in understanding 20th century Bengal. It has been sort of discarded in the realm of high politics by Professor Jalal's work and most importantly and others. But in terms of still understanding the day-to-day relations between Hindus and Muslims, there is sort of an obsession with riots and conflict, as if the two communities were always fighting, and it's an obsession which I find very puzzling to understand. And I mean, just this one quote is very revealing. There was a controversy about music before the mosque for a little bit. Muslims do not tolerate music before the mosque, and there were some disturbances in the late 1920s, and one historian, Pradip Datta, inferred that this showed the impossibility of coexistence. Now, this is the problem when you rely too much on colonial police reports and sources like that. Of course, they will tell you that coexistence is impossible. What is completely ignored in this sort of view is to just acknowledge how much music Hindus and Muslims made together in this period, in both the elite circles of Kolkata. That's a different story to be told, but also in Gombhira. I'll just tell you one song, and for me, the major sources to tell this story, I'll be very honest, for a long time I struggled how to write about the 1930s. I could see how to write about the Swadeshi period and how I would write about partition. Those arguments were there. The 1930s I struggled a lot about, because nothing that I had read in the literature seemed to fit with the material I was actually seeing. And I realized, and this is sort of a lesson for all of us, that when that happens, just to give priority to the material and just work on that. And then I realized the theme of communalism and communal conflict is just not useful in understanding what is going on here. And so I really put a lot of weight on these manuscripts, all from the 30s and 40s that I found in Malda, still preserved in a very fragile state in homes of performers. That's actually the key source for this part of the book. And I'll just cite one song. This is by a Muslim performer called Shahjad Ali. He's blaming Shiva for the wartime economic crisis in 1941. I think everyone in Malda is more or less clear that blaming Shiva is sort of a paradigm of the songs. He says, Shiva, you are not as simple as you look. You get fat eating the food we give, but then you make us suffer. You and your aide Nandi made plans to take away the nation's gold and silver. You ate our rice and then took our gold to sell it to others. The song says that Shiva's image as a forgetful hemp smoker is a deceptive one, just like the gentlemanly face Englishmen put up in India. In reality, the god and his aide, like the colonial state, ate a nation's food and stole its wealth. Shahjad, in effect, called Shiva a liar and a thief. But no one in Malda would see that as a Muslim insulting a Hindu god. Such dialogue were part of the world of Gambhira, where laughing at Shiva was never restricted by religious boundaries. This is one simple point I think I want to make in this chapter. Moving on, I think we come to this is the 30s and 40s, when Gambhira really becomes an instrument of mass politics. And you see that as a political sphere of its own. It's never quite dictated by elite politics or the sorts of negotiations and conflicts that are happening in Calcutta. Related, of course, but I think it has its own context. Something more interesting happens after 47, which is after the division of Malda. 2/3 of the district becomes part of Pakistan. 1/3 of the district becomes part of Pakistan, 2/3 remains in India. And some performers move. Sufi Master was one of them. It's noteworthy, the movement happens through the 1950s, more gradually, it doesn't happen instantly at the moment of partition. For a long time they remain, but because of other factors and the way the two post-colonial states were moving, some Muslim performers moved. Sufi was one of them. It is Sufi who goes and restructures the performance from Shiva and the peasants to the grandfather and grandson talking. Again, here we come to an interpretive question. Why does he do that? And there's not much clear answer about it. But we can suggest some answers, I think. One of them being that he was already very well known as a singer of Shiva songs. And when he goes to Pakistan, then East Pakistan, there was already an idiom of Nana and Nati songs there in areas. There are some writings I found from Gambhira performers from the early 1950s, which are fascinating in that they say, now here we are in a Muslim majority context. Now, if we start blaming Shiva and shouting at Shiva, it'll give a wrong message to our Hindu neighbors who are still in Pakistan. So for their sake, we want to restructure the performance slightly. This is one among many viewpoints, but I think one worth highlighting. This seems to be, and this is sort of the benefit of ethnography and paying close attention to stories and myths around. This seems to be one of the reasons. And then when you look at cultural symbols, it is true that grandfather or Nana is also the same word that is used to refer to Shiva in Malda. So in many ways, as one performer put it, you are talking to the divine grandfather, we are talking to the human grandfather. So it's the same relation juxtaposed in a symbolic way. These are two Gambhira performers working in their little field in Malda. I just want to point out that they are in their costumes. This is what they wear during their performances too. The hat is in the signature. You find this conical hat throughout Southeast Asia and even China and Bengal. It's a classic symbol of the peasant. And Shiva, of course, is himself a peasant, right? So it plays to that symbols rather than a clear division between Hindu and Muslim. To draw a long story short, the thing changes with the independence of Bangladesh in 1971. Then what used to be a localized tradition within Chapai becomes a national tradition of Bangladesh. I must note that this is the moment when the two Gambhiras really diverge and become two very distinct national traditions. I tell this story in detail in one of the chapters, but it is true that only when the Bangladesh side receives a huge state patronage, which the Indian side never does, it remains a very small sort of a isolated performance in Malda, which gives them sort of a political advantage. I find the Bangladesh Gambhira, because they receive so much state support and state investment, can't challenge power as outright as the Indian side. And they express this discontent to me again and again and again. But it is in that period that the two Gambhiras really diverge. You see the two Gambhira performers performing here. This is from Bangladesh TV in the 1970s. They were a very famous pair. Here you see them, the same two, on two sides of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the first Prime Minister of Bangladesh and a major figure of the country. He took a personal interest in the tradition and took them. So this is to give you a sense of how difference, as we understand it, has a lot to do with nation-state investment more than any inherent difference between the people living there. I think I'll slowly wrap up now because I want to finish by 6:30, which will leave you time for questions. I think the main thoughts I want to leave you with and what I want to do here is to focus on histories of Hindus and Muslims and what they do in everyday life as opposed to those of Hinduism and Islam. And of course that of folk culture. I think this is a very small shift, but it actually goes a long way in pushing our research questions. And we can think about what methodological and conceptual shifts it implies, focusing on people and what they do as opposed to sort of structured religious ideas. For Bengal in specific, I think this is specifically for people who work on Bengal, this is quite crucial to think of the cultural history of Bengal beyond Calcutta. A lot of work has happened on Bengal, but I think 90% of it remains about a very small cultural literary in Calcutta, but we really have to move beyond it to understand, not for the sake of diversity alone. I think just the paradigm of how we look at Bengal, which is a country larger than France, I imagine can't be reduced to just one small class here. And finally, to put emphasis on the dialectic between, as I call the Mufassir and the metropolis. What is perhaps most humbling about the story of Gambhira is how committed performers have been in depicting the common fate of poor, low-caste Hindus and Muslims, preserving shared social spaces beyond religious and national boundaries. The urban gentlemanly class in India, who tend to treat popular performers either as simple-minded villagers or as museum exhibits of an eternal folk tradition, have scarcely done justice to the political acumen and ethical sensibilities of Gambhira performances. We have seen throughout this book performers taunting oppressors, challenging elite narratives, framing socioeconomic demands, and responding to seismic political shifts. As Binoy Sarkar, one of the few urban gentlemen who appreciated the social importance of the tradition, had understood, Gambhira was not just about entertainment, but about constructing ethical and political ideas. This construction, while dependent on broader political economic changes, is not simply derivative of broader top-down ideologies, but woven into everyday life of the two communities in Malda and Chapai. Performances such as Gambhira, in other words, have managed to accommodate difference across ethnic or religious divides, even transcending borders of nation states. Once we see popular spaces outside the rubric of national territory, it becomes clear that communities we assume to be in conflict, if not outright war, have shared many social spaces in everyday life. There can be no better instance of this than Kashmir, a place we have been accustomed to seeing as a war zone for many years now. But even there, Hindus and Muslims come together in performances of the arms, who, like Gambhira performers, use humor to grapple with misery and richness of the life in the valley. Relations that sustain these shared spaces of performance have survived despite the creation of national borders and the politics of communalism. Many Muslim Kashmiris, we know from new research, continue to look after the houses and orchards of their Hindu neighbors even after the exodus of the Pandits. In Bengal too, Hindu and Muslims still look after each other's places of worship and even take responsibility for each other's last rites. So long as these relations survive the violence of border making, popular performances, which are nothing if not creative expressions of everyday life, will remain shared spaces of life and laughter. I must say I was writing this before the Bengal elections of last year, when the national media made us believe that all of this will be completely swept off and the right wing, the BJP, which was rising then, will simply take over Bengal. So I had some anxiety while writing this, but I think the thesis has been somewhat vindicated since. The social spaces of laughter may not have the power to influence fateful events such as the partition or the making of citizenship laws. Yet for many, these are spaces of reconciliation, of laughing and crying together, the last embers of hope in searching for ways to live with each other in a highly militarized borderland. And something I want to take from this book in my further work currently is to see how this idea of a shared culture space, to what extent can translate into a shared political space, because I think that's the next leap to take. I think the argument about cultural spaces has been made, but we really need to now push on the question of federalism as a cultural and political concept in South Asia, where many of the similar dynamics we see in cultural space can result in a robust and resilient alternative to partition and post-colonial nation states. I think that is where I want to go with this project thereafter. I have a few minutes. I think I will just end with the last performance in the book and leave you with it. It was taking place near this structure. So this is an 1832 structure. This was one of the entrances to the city of Gaur in Malda. It's called the Kotwali Darwaza. This is an 1832 painting by Henry Creighton, 1817 painting, when it was to be just a thing. Now it's this, it's the international border, and you can actually see the border crossing. It's a bamboo fence that guards in between. Once the southern entrance to the city of Gaur, the Kotwali Darwaza now marks the border crossing point of Mahadip. Little is left of its splendor, with its arch collapsed and watchtowers crumbled. All that remains is a line of bricks trailing down towards the Pagla River, reinforced by a new steel fence. The 1947 border had cut through the ruins of the city of Gaur, giving each state its share of old mosques, towers, and gateways. About a mile south of the gate into Bangladesh, Hakim and Shishir, the two performers, stood in the courtyard of the little golden mosque, Choto Shona Masjid. Shishir played the role of a present-day Indian border guard. Hakim, a traveler in Malda, and this is happening many years into the future. And this performance was taking place when the tension about the citizenship laws in India was at its height, where, taking illegal Bangladeshis out and whatnot. So this is the time when this performance is happening, and these borderlands were very charged at that moment. Stop, the guard yelled. A Bangladeshi is trying to enter India. What? Hakim asked. Have you been asleep for the past 100 years? There's nothing called India or Bangladesh anymore. Only people, Manush, on both sides of the border. You must be mad, the guard says. What are you talking about? I have heard that there were countries called India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, once upon a time, divided by iron fences. Hakim said, taking off his hat and fanning himself with it. But that was many years back in history. Look at the Kotwali Darwaza. Once a majestic gate, today only some humble ruins. Those fences have long disappeared. You make no senses, Shishir, the guard, protested. India is India and Bangladesh is Bangladesh, and that is how it will always be. Okay, you tell me, Nana, does the river Mahadananda not flow on both sides of the border that you still think exists? Do people on both sides not speak the same language? Do they not produce the same rice, mangoes, and silk? Do they not sing the same songs? Shishir nodded. Hakim then asked whether houses on both sides looked the same. Tilling the land here still yields heaps of medieval bricks, thin ones simply called Gauri. In North India, these are called the Lakhauri bricks from Lucknow. In these parts, they are called Gauriya from gold. The bricks of gold, which peasants in Malda and Champa used to build houses. If people on both sides are the same, how can there be two countries, Nana? Now you are the one not making any sense. The last trucks to cross into the Shona Masjid land port rolled past us. Night fell on the gray stones of the mosque. There were no electric lights here, except for the one beam from the border post staring into the ruins. Don't be fooled by searchlights and military boots. Hakim looked at the audience. The border did not exist even 100 years ago, and one day it will sink again into the depths of history. All that will remain are people on both sides singing their songs while rowing their boats. And then they sang together. One day the barbed wire will go. Many hundreds of years later, if travelers wonder what the border was like, Tell them it was a boundary of iron and mud that divided peoples and rivers, a boundary of guns, a boundary of blood, and tell them that we were not fooled by it. We saw it for what it was, and we only laughed at it, for it was the boundary of laughter.
That was a delightful talk at a time when gods are being weaponized to divide people and justify bloodshed. I think this work of yours really sort of is extremely refreshing. But my question is really to try and get you to clarify further for the audience your critique of folk culture, which is really partly this sort of high and low traditions and how eventually the high tradition will take over from the low tradition. What you're doing here is to show how, and I think what you do very well in your book is to show how a supposedly folk or low tradition comes to really define and inform, if not define, the so-called high tradition. So, I mean, how you're collapsing or altering those conceptually, I think we could hear a little bit more about, because you have foregrounded the importance of your dislike for folk culture, which I presume is partly because of this supposed, the low eventually being taken over by the high. But here, certainly those who are representative of the so-called low are claiming a much greater space in the narrative. And so I wonder whether you could explain more your thoughts on how this works, certainly in terms of your own context, of your own work, how you've done it certainly with Sarkar providing you. But I mean, how possible is this to go beyond your own context? Because I mean, this is a wonderful project, but I think that conceptually there are takeaways from here, which would be very good to de-weaponize gods, as is happening in much of South Asia.
So thank you so much, Professor Jalal, for that wonderful way of putting it. Yes, I also think there's a tendency to see the sort of high culture as completely divorced from its low contexts, and this is to a great extent scholarly choice too. So, just for instance, often you will find intellectuals being emphasized, their westernizedness emphasized, and so on. You see that for Sarkar too in much of the scholarship on Sarkar, and by now there is a significant bit, and the emphasis is on that he was a transnational figure who knew German and Italian and engaged, with really not foregrounding how much of the so-called low or the rural context shaped the way of seeing. And I think this is true in much of in India. I think if you look at even, Maharashtra, certainly, I think the Marathi intelligentsia, I think in a different context, but I think very similar arguments can be made. I was also quite, there's a recent book on Sri Lanka and the Sri Lankan civil war by Jim Sykes, which I think also hints that that's a real civil war going on for years. But there too, still we have Tamil and Sinhala musicians working together in a situation not too different from the part that I described. I think, and also I think it came from my basic ethnographic insight of talking to folk performers and just being surprised at how much they know. City people tend to see folk performers as just ignorant villagers who don't, but they keep abreast of the world. They read, and now with the internet, even before the internet, I think we used to read newspapers in English and regional languages, and they do have a working knowledge of English too, most of them, at least in the late 20th century. So they do know a lot about the world, and I think that is a key point too. But yes, I will keep thinking about this point. Do we see questions in the webinar? Do they pop for?
Are there questions from the audience? You can't do that. I think with this webinar doesn't allow that, or does it?
No, it does, but there are no questions.
Why at the moment? So there is one by. Go ahead,
This one, this is maybe a little bit outside the frame of your project, but with this talk of traditional culture and that slide you showed of the masks, I sort of started thinking of that as possible commodification. I'm not sure if I believe those masks are in a museum not being sold, but has there been an effort to not only nationalize, but try and commodify this art form? And how have the reformers responded to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have the last chapter is precisely on this topic. It's called Economies of Expression, and I think it's exactly on this context. And what is really surprising is the two outcomes on two sides of the border, because what you have in Bangladesh is NGOs becoming extremely powerful. If you know about Bangladesh, you know NGOs are a real force. They're in basically running the state. These are huge institutions. And they do this, they basically have taken charge of Gambhira as a performance, and they recruit performers to sing what they have to sing in like what they want them to sing in terms of the NGOs projects and so on, often doing not so good things to the performers themselves, who try to resist it as much as they can. But these are poor people who need money to survive, and with lack of state support, they have to often give it to the NGOs. And I actually describe that in some detail. What happens in India is actually very different, because in India, the NGOs are not as powerful as in Bangladesh, and for that matter, not very interested, because the tradition in India is, the Gambhira is really not much known beyond Malda in India. It's much more localized than in Bangladesh. What happens there is precisely the commodification of these masks and sort of reducing Gambhira to an art form of mask craft, really, not even art, in some ways that can be sold. And there you have investment of both private capital and the state in doing that. So yes, the answer is yes, absolutely.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Aniket. That was insightful. I had two questions. One was kind of adding on to Professor Jalal's question about folk culture. I wanted to ask whether there is, I mean, to what extent is this idea of folk culture a construct of this so-called colonial modernity? Is it Oriental in nature, or has this idea of folk culture kind of existed within the Indian elite prior to colonialism? And the second question I had is, when you talk about cultural, this shared space, I'm wondering, in the contemporary context of heavily militarized borders, is there truly a shared space beyond one of cultural memory, or is there kind of any tangible interaction between, these two sides of these two, communities that are performing the same thing, but, is there any interaction anymore within those two communities? And speaking of your future, projects, like, do you think that a true, tangible interaction is necessary for some sort of political shared space to be created?
So thank you very much. These are both really sharp and crucial questions. The folk culture question first. I think there was some notion of high and low cultures even before colonialism, for sure. But I think the point I'm trying to make here is basically very much partly because of the time frame of the study too, and partly also because I think I'm also talking specifically of the Calcutta elite, who very much draw on essentialized notions of the folk. But you will see, I draw a distinction. Now, there is a very classic work on this called The Parlor and the Streets by Shumanta Banerjee in Calcutta, which is sort of a paradigm. It shows that how urban elite culture and the culture of the streets become separate by the end of the 19th century. This is the thesis. I don't quite buy that, and I don't quite see that. What you really see is a very curious interplay of even the elites, whom you will see dismissing some of these things outside as folk culture and bad, secretly somehow enjoying them, in many ways leading a dual life, which is part of a colonial society in many ways. That is why you have someone like Vinay Kumar Sharkar, who doesn't draw this distinction as clearly as the elites a generation before. But he does have very close roots to the performers and Malda and so on. So yes, I think that is the interplay is what I find most interesting. Absolutely, and I think the one thing you see, this is sort of the importance of a historical study. If you see just the present day, the so-called shared spaces are much fewer for simply, although they still exist. I mean, performers do travel across, and they just have to go through a lot of hassle, as I described at the beginning. Sometimes, with the internet, it has become even easier for them to move. So on, but I think the key point here is historically they have been shared spaces. I mean, and even after so-called partition till the 1950s, there was a great deal of movement and great deal of cooperation at all levels. Even I think the elites of two sides sort of have reached kind of an understanding on that. There is a very interesting episode in the archives of the mango traders, the orchard owners of both sides of the border, coming to an agreement and asking for free border movement of mangoes, and the magistrates, I think till late 1949, the magistrates had enough authority to allow trade across borders. So I think these are sort of significant moments to think of. But increasingly, I think those spaces have shrunk, and it's a real challenge to.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk and for using the Gambhira, to show it, to problematize the issue of the borderlands, to show the construct of ethical and political ideas by performers. I was wondering if you could show us a different side, that of the audience that is doing the laughing, the audience that is absorbing this humor, the richness, the misery of this life. Because performance by definition, the performers have to have an effect on audience. And I was wondering if you could unpack the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is crucial. And the best thing about, the most interesting thing about popular performances of this sort is that because the performance is not separated by a stage or anything, the interactions are much closer. And as I think this is why I narrated out some of the performances, you see audiences interjecting all the time and speaking out. And this is an interesting gender dimension to this, I find, because I'm often, it's kind of rare for folk traditions. They're either exclusively male or exclusively women. So this happens to be one that is performed by men, but the audience is of both genders and often mostly women. And so you find women interjecting and talking, children interjecting and talking in many ways. And one interesting thing is that one reason this becomes a shared space so successfully is that performers have to cater to audiences from all communities. There are Muslim audiences, there are Hindu audiences, and you sort of have to speak to most of them or to exchange with most of them. So that I think is a pretty crucial element of it. So I think that is absolutely a major part of it.
Thank you.
So first, I just want to congratulate you. This is such an accomplishment, and it's such an honor to have been a witness to it for so long. So it's just so gratifying and thrilling to see this and hear this and to read it. My question is, it's more of a comment, but maybe it can be questionified. And that is that I think one of the challenges of there's a real challenge, an ethical challenge and a representational challenge in locating affect in political histories, and locating affect in histories of violence, beyond thinking, in terms of memory and nostalgia on the one hand, or the affects that sort of emerge from our youth as trauma, or the kind of affect that we assume as a part of sort of forms of resistance. And I think you do such an excellent job of narrating affect in political histories through performance. And in terms of performance, it tends to go towards like dramaturgical theories that offer us a sort of vocabulary for thinking about affect. But where you are situating this at the juncture of performance and the political, I think gives us a really interesting point of entry into affect in the historical process. There's no question.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about affect.
Thank you. I think that is quite crucial. I do not use affect as a key analytical category in the book. But I think it's, as you can see, a lot of these attachments are very, very emotive and sometimes allows for, as we know, the, and you don't, I mean, And that is, I think, the key affective term in the book is laughter and humor, as opposed to trauma and violence, which would be one way of narrating this story for sure. And that is how, as we know, partition histories are routinely written about, and with good reason. And I respect that, but I did want to say another side of the story, because whenever you see a militarized borderland, that's the immediate first affect you draw, and again with good reason. But this is why I wanted to highlight a sort of a different sort of.
There is a question in the chat, Aniket.
Let us speak up a little.
On politicizing folk traditions, one can imagine governments on both sides of border using Gambhira to promote national messages of Ma Mati Manush. I assume the performers are alert to this. Do they push back? This is a question from Brian Hatcher.
Yeah, I'm just reading the question on the chat once. Yeah, I mean, they do. First of all, hi, Professor Hatcher. I couldn't see you, but I think there is, political push on both sides. And I think one thing that performers try to do is at least in India, is to sort of try to maintain their own voice outside the mobilizations of political parties, which does happen, but they sometimes have to give in to it. And in the last chapter, I sort of describe a play done by an urban group in Malda, which is a theater group. They're not Gambhira performers, but citizen theaters. It's an interesting class distinction that we see. And it talks about the plight of Gambhira performers. And one of the plight is that first a party, and then it was the communists. This was before 2011, but now then the other parties sort of come in and try to take them to their side. But the hero of the performance sort of resists all of that and ends up remaining poor and keeping his own voice intact and so on. So I think this is again the question of space, and I think this is a good way to talk about space and territory. I think this point. There is, to an extent, a resistance against the territorialization of the space of Gambhira. And there are all sorts of people trying to territorialize it, not just nation states, but also elites of different sides. And sometimes they do take it because, of course, they have to eat something and live. But there is a real push to maintain its autonomy of a sort. I don't like that term, but it's independence. Much more successfully, I must add, in India than in Bangladesh, because in Bangladesh, the investment of the state is so much that it's even more difficult for them to do so.
Yeah, I have a question that's a lot simpler than a lot of the others are asked already. But they're questions about methods, and I'm coming to this as like a senior undergraduate anthropology student. And I was wondering if you could please share your experiences working across different archival materials. Like I noticed that one of the photos you showed was from a family collection, and then bringing both historical, archival, and ethnographic material together in your book. And then I also have another question about translation and how you worked through translation, like across different languages, but then also writing song and performance into text.
No, excellent. I think, thank you. This is a crucial question, and it took me a long time to actually think of both how to do the research, but also how to present it in a way that it remains accessible to a broader audience in some ways. Though not very broad, but still broad enough to do this. I have, throughout the book, I have the originals in the footnotes. I mean, if you want to see the original songs and so on, at least the ones translated from manuscript sources are all in the original. The printed sources, I have simply cited the original Bengali print so that people can go check if they want. As opposed to, the archive question is actually crucial because there is the major archive is in Bengali, and I was sort of insistent to work on Bengali language material on this. You still find a lot of work on Bengal based exclusively on English language sources, partly because Bengalis wrote in Calcutta, wrote a lot in English, and a lot of scholars just work on that. But you actually do see a very interesting change in voice. Even say Vinay Kumar Sarkar, when he writes in English for a Western audience, is very different from when he writes in Bangla for audiences in Kolkata. In Malda. So I think the attention to those are actually quite crucial. Bringing ethnography and archival work together is, I think, the major challenge in this, and I don't know how successful I have been in doing this. There are different ways, in historical anthropology. It also kind of depends on how much you let your discipline dictate you. For example, if you're writing in a strong disciplinary paradigm of anthropology, there are paradigms of, if you want to make a theoretical contribution to anthropology, you write it in a certain way. If you want to do a full-scale ethnography, you write it in a certain way. The way I did it, I wanted this to be primarily a contribution to history, but using ethnography innovatively. So what I have done throughout the book is juxtapose a section of archival work with a section of ethnography. Which I thought was the most interesting way of showing it. It also sort of goes beyond encapsulating the past and the present into separate boxes, and you're able to show more interplay that way. And that's one way of it.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for your insightful talk. I was thinking, given the politics of the folk being subversive, laughter-inducing, how much of the state relations between India and Bangladesh allow for Gambhira to continue to exist? And also, do you think a similar performance could be conceived of either on the Punjab or Kashmir border? Are there any performances that you're aware of, or yeah?
Yes, no, thank you very much. My first reaction to the first question is Gambhira seems to be going despite of the two governments than because of them. That is my sense, because there are some government orchestrated efforts on both sides, but they don't seem to go very far. What happens more commonly is that people just know other people on other sides of the border and they invite each other and so on. The government orchestrated ones, again, it falls back into the same problem of nationalism and folk culture and market. They choose people who sing their tunes and so on. So, there is some literature recently on sort of the fairs that have government organized fairs of folk culture that have been happening on both sides. This actually has the effect of destroying the original Gambhira teams. So what happens often is when an NGO or when say a state government or the national government wants to curate a show, they often pick the best performer from every team in the city and make a show. That's disastrous because often Gambhira teams, you have a main performer, like you see there's a Mool Shilpi, a main performer who around whom the group congeals. Now, if you take one from each, the original groups get destroyed. This is exactly what has happened in Chapai in many cases. I think that's kind of performers resist that very much. So that's one answer to your question, I think. About Punjab and Kashmir, yes, I think so. I mean, this is, I don't know the ethnographic context as closely myself, but I think, so I know Farina Meer's work, for example, on.
No, I think the closest is the bhans.
Yeah, the
bhans are at marriage ceremonies, their jokes. I mean, in terms of, it's basically sarcasm, which is in jokes. So the bhand is the closest, and that's a Punjab tradition. I mean, I think that would be the closest. But whether that's a borderland, I don't think it's a borderland question at all. It's just an example of how so-called elite culture is undermined by a different kind of rationality and a different kind of lucidity, which is absolutely hilarious. I mean, you have to sort of experience a bhand performance. I mean, it doesn't have Shiva, but it does have, I mean, they're just two people. And one is a fool, and there's an instrument, a leather instrument that is used to hit the other person every time he cracks a joke. So it's a very interesting, I mean, I would think that would be the closest, but I'm sure there are others in other regional cultures that I think just need to be, again, it's a question of what you're looking for. And if you're looking for it, you'll find it.
I think there's a question in the chat. Do you have a question?
First of all, I'd like to comment on your book. It's really
Can you please speak up? We can't hear you.
The book is quite interesting, and the dialectic is back on agenda. It is the dialectical city spaces between the whole perception and the third space, which you have created, actually created a psychosocial cleavage between the self and the city. So there is a sort of cleavage which you have created, and it is an unbridgeable gap sometimes, I think so, which is not bridged easily. So it's like a perceived, conceived, or lived city space differences, which one can easily go through with. And it's a concept of trialectics by the theorist, which you may have read. He's a spatial theorist, that is Lefebvre. You quoted Dorian Massey actually, and Massey is actually inspired by Lefebvre's concept of trialectics, and he actually gave this concept. There is a perceived city spaces, there is a conceived and the lived city spaces. All of them are actually creating a gap because the lived experiences are somehow different. As you quoted one of the example, that the lived experiences actually change the whole psychology of the person. So it really looks me interesting to grab this idea that you really interpret the boundaries in a very different way. Thank you so very much for the talk.
Yes.
I see a question in the chat, which I can quickly answer. It's from Ashmita Sharkar. Hi. Firstly, Ashmita and her father, Ashim Sharkar, she's now a student in Oxford. They were my hosts in Malda. So hi. And she's asked me about the gendered nature of Gombhira performance, are men, and how you incorporate. I think this is a crucial question. In the sense of, yes, as I mentioned, that it is true that that the performers are exclusively male until I believe very recent to the extent of me completing after the book. I heard there's talk of forming a women's Gombhira team, which will certainly change things. But I think it twists. It has more to do with, I think you can argue that even shared spaces has certain limits of sharing, but not if you consider the audience. I think this is why I emphasize the dialectical relation between the dialogical relation between the performers and the audiences. The audiences are primarily women, and I do have some chapters in the book. For reasons of privacy, I did not include many chapters on the family life of these performers. Many of them told me that they don't want to be identified, not even whether they are married or single, and I've sometimes mixed up their ages too, all for the sake of just to protect their anonymity. So I guess except in one instance, you will miss that part of the story. But often they do have, women do play a crucial role in maintaining their families, as I point out in some places. I do not think it so much reinforces gender roles, and in the sense, well, I that's not the right way of putting it. I think it is a performance performed by men in terms of the Shiva and the four figures, but you sometimes do have women in the audience jumping up and making comments and exchanging, and I think that is one way to see some exchanges there.
Well, first of all, congratulations on a wonderful book and also for a very moving presentation. And I'd also like to thank your teachers at Tufts for delivering you fully formed at Harvard so that I have nothing to do
You're still making us work.
as a
You're
research
making me still
supervisor.
work with you.
Yes. Now, just a brief comment about the quality of Gambhira as a popular performance. I mean, if there is one adjective that comes to my mind, is that it is irreverent. And there is a constant interrogation of power, and basically trying to dissolve power by laughing at it. Okay, so that's and so in that sense, I understand that if there is nation-state patronage or even state patronage of any sort, or in the Bangladeshi instance, if there are big NGOs who begin to take over this performance to present to the world, there will be some damage to what Gambhira has been over the 100 to 150 year period that you have studied in this book. But if it comes to the larger theoretical point that you are wanting to make, that you want to make a move from understanding shared cultural spaces to possible domains where you can have shared political spaces, there I think that you might actually find that there will be some degree of interaction between state and politics. So what I'm getting at is that if you think about Bangladesh, I just wondered, did Sheikh Mujibur Rahman begin to take interest in Gambhira only after 1971? Or could it possibly have been a part of some kind of quality of Bengali culture, even during the movement that led to 1971?
I mean, you're saying from 47 to 19, nothing happened. I mean, that's not what he's saying.
No, that's what, but I'm saying that it's not just, what I'm getting at is that I'm absolutely sure that, I mean, there was this question from Brian Hatcher about, Mamati Manush. If, for example, someone in West Bengal reads your book, you might find that there's going to be now an attempt to give more patronage to this Gambhira performance in the way that Jatra is being highlighted. And what I'm saying is that here, in the battle between those who are calling for greater federalism against sort of central power, there may well be some degree of linking up between those who are trying to wield regional power versus those who are trying to think in terms of the centralized power of the nation state, particularly in India. And my sense is that while it represents something of a threat to the quality of the performance, if there is too much of this kind of patronage, but if it is sort of done, let's say in the Binoy Sarkar style of the early 20th century, it may actually help in contributing to creating some shared, political spaces, questioning the power of the nation states as they exist today, the nation states, then might be the case. So I don't see that you have to, in some ways, completely protect the, purity, as it were, of this, cultural performance, that there will necessarily be some degree of political engagement. The question is of what kind, and whether it does, intrinsic damage to this irreverent quality of the popular performance and the way that it questions power.
Thank you very much. I'll just quickly say, that's a great point, and thank you. And I should clarify, I am not very invested in the purity of the tradition either, because I think that's one thing the historical narrative sort of shows, that there is no pure core. I think what I'm thinking is one as a study. and our elective affinities. I mean, I think Gambhira performers have always supported the kind of politics that have given them a degree of autonomy while standing for the same causes. You see this in the Swadeshi movement. You see this also with the communists and the lefts in the interwar decades, and finally much later too. So I think insofar as they are, and even I think during this latest elections, we saw that very, very clearly that they sort of joined forces with what they thought was the right politics. I think if that level of space is given, this is another example of sort of the dialectical relationship between two.
Well, thank you very much. It was excellent. The book is being marketed all over the place. Good luck with that.
Thank you to everyone.
Well, thank you. Doing. We should at least exchange.
Hi, good to finally meet you.
Likewise.
How was your trip?
It was great. It was great.
Where'd you, so you guys went to?
So we were in Manuel Antonio,
Yeah, great.
which was nice. That was my favorite. That was my favorite place. And then we were in.
That was excellent.